robot warfare. No longer in the realm of science fiction, war by remote control is happening in the here and now. As control drones target Taliban leaders in Afghanistan, the number of unmanned systems on the ground in Iraq has gone from 0 to 12,000 over the last 5 years. And with 44 nations, including Australia, now buying, building and using ever smarter and more autonomous robots, will traditional moral and psychological barriers to killing simply disappear like dots on a computer screen? Here's P.W. Singer.
These technologies don't merely remove the human operator from risk, they record everything that they see. And in so doing, they're reshaping our relationship to war. Now, being able to see combat footage, there's literally thousands of video clips of combat footage up on sites like youtube.com right now. Being able to see this is arguably a good thing. We're seeing connections between the war front and the home front that never existed before. But of course, the ability to watch scenes of real-world battle on your iPhone is turning, for a lot of people, war into a form of entertainment. And the soldiers have a name for it. They call it war porn. I got a typical example of this in an email that was sent to me, and the title line of the email said, "Watch this." And we've all gotten emails like that. The video clip attached, usually is a really cool score in a rugby game, or it's a video of some nerdy fat kid dancing in his basement who doesn't know that we're watching. It's something like that. In this case, the video clip was a scene of a Predator drone strike. Hellfire missile drops, goes into target, explosion, bodies riding the crest of the explosion. It was set to music. It was set to the song "I Just Want to Fly" by the band Sugar Ray. We turned an act of war into a crappy music video. And the danger of war porn is that it's not just that we're watching, but it has a warping effect on us. This ability to watch more but actually experience less tricks us into thinking that we understand what's happening. And I think there's a good sports parallel for this. It's the difference between watching, for example, a rugby match on TV, where the players are these little tiny figures on the screen, versus watching a rugby match in the stadium and seeing what a professional athlete really does look like face to face, which is a very different experience from playing in that match yourself and knowing what it's like to be tackled or something like that. These are very different experiences. But notice how when we watch the game on TV, we yell at the screen when they do something dumb. Like, how could you do that? Because we think we understand, but we don't. But YouTube war is even worse because we're not watching the whole game. We're watching the sports highlight reel of the war. All the context, all the strategy, it just becomes highlight reels for us to blitz through. The irony in all of this is that, again, it's not the technology that matters, but it all comes back to us. It all comes back to our human psychology. And there's a policy example of this that we're wrestling with right now that sounds very science fiction-like. What is the message that we think we are sending when we use robots in war versus what is the message that's being received? And I wanted to know this, so I went around interviewing people, and I thought the best example of the message we thought we were sending was from a senior Pentagon official in the Bush administration, who described how our, quote, unmanning of war plays to our strength. The thing that scares people is our technology. But what about when you go ask those people 7,000 miles away? And this is what the leading newspaper editor of Lebanon had to say. And while we were speaking, there was actually a drone flying above him at that moment. And he said, quote, "This is just another sign of the cold-hearted, cruel Israelis and Americans who are also cowards because they send out machines to fight us. They don't want to fight us like real men, but they're afraid to fight. So all we have to do to defeat them is kill just a few of their soldiers." I'm not saying that's accurate. It's perceptions, and they're perceptions that are going in completely opposite directions. And the danger, of course, is in a counterinsurgency, in a war of ideas, perceptions do matter. Another ripple effect, though, is the changing meaning of going to war. I talked about how it's changing for the nation, but it's also changing for the individual. For For the last 5,000 years, whether you were talking about the ancient Greeks going to war against Troy, or my grandfather going to war against the Japanese in the Pacific in World War II, this meaning of going to war really meant the same exact thing. At its fundamental level, it meant going to a place of such danger you might never see your family again. When you went to war, you were taking a risk that you might never come home again. That's what it's meant for the last 5,000 years, until today. And this is what a Predator squadron commander described of what it was like to fight insurgents in Afghanistan while never leaving the state of Nevada from his base just outside Las Vegas. Quote, "You are going to war for 12 hours. You're shooting weapons at targets. You're directing kills on enemy combatants. And then you get in the car and you drive home. And within 20 minutes, you're sitting at the dinner table talking to your kids about their schoolwork." This is a fundamentally different experience of going to war. And actually, it's turning out to be a very tough one. These units of remote warriors actually have, in certain cases, as high, and in other cases, even higher levels of combat stress and fatigue than the units physically in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, another ripple effect of this plays out in terms of the demographics of war. Who can do what in war? One of my other favorite stories in the book is about a high school dropout who he dropped out of high school and he wanted to make his dad proud of him again. So he enlisted in the U.S. Army. The recruiting sergeant looked at his high school transcript and he asked him, "What would you like to be in the Army?" And he said, "I'd like to be a helicopter mechanic." He looked at the transcript and said, "I'm sorry, son, you're not qualified to be a helicopter mechanic because you failed your high school English class. Would you like to be an unmanned aerial systems operator instead?" He turned out to be incredible at this. He turned out to be a natural. It wasn't that he was a natural, it's really that he'd spent his entire life training for this by playing video games, which is why I joke he failed the high school literature class. But the point is, he turned out to be so good from it that they brought him back from his first deployment. They promoted him. They made him a specialist, which is effectively the second lowest rank in the entire US military. And then they made him an instructor in the pilot training academy. It's a really interesting story. Because of this technology, this young man found himself. He made his dad proud of him again. He's serving his nation. I told the story at last year's US Air Force National Convention. They didn't like the story. You have a 19-year-old high school dropout, an enlisted man, not an officer, who's not just an instructor in the pilot training academy right now, but has taken out more targets, saved arguably more American lives than every single F-22 pilot combined. The jet fighter pilots look at him the way the knights looked at the peasants, just when the peasants were given guns. Now, as you saw, robotics is not just little things that move beyond us, they're also changing our own bodies. One of the other powerful stories in the book is about the more than 400 soldiers that have lost arms or legs due to these roadside bombs that have had them replaced with robotic prosthetics, with robotic arms and legs. Robotic arms and legs that are so good that over 400 soldiers have gone back to serve in their combat units with these artificial arms and legs. The head of the program calls it the Luke Skywalker effect. Now, if you remember your Star Wars, in the second Star Wars movie, or rather what I believe is the actual second Star Wars movie, because the other three didn't happen, in Empire Strikes Back, our hero gets his hand cut off by a lightsaber. And we go, oh my gosh, he's done for, Luke's done for. And then at the very end of the movie, we see him flexing his robot hand. That was science fiction when I was growing up. For over 400 soldiers, that's been their reality. But of course, we're humans. We're folks that don't stop at replacement. We also want to work on enhancement, bigger, better, faster, stronger. So a good illustration of this is a couple months ago, it was revealed that a British SAS Special Air Service, a Special Operations trooper, had had laser eye surgery. So what? What's the big deal about that? Anyone in this room had laser eye surgery? Raise your hand. Okay, so let's compare his laser eye surgery to what you got. Did yours allow you to see 400 meters at night? Basically, we gave him the version of a cat's eyes vision. Much of what you're hearing here is that there are always two sides to every revolution. We may be experiencing Moore's law, but we haven't gotten rid of Murphy's law. We're getting incredible science fiction-like capabilities, but we also have incredible science fiction-like dilemmas to figure out. And these dilemmas sometimes evolve from very small things, from what a vice president of a robotics company called oops moments. When things don't work out with your robot, it's just an oops moment, he said. What are examples of oops moments in war so far? Well, sometimes they're kind of funny. Like, for example, when they tested out a machine gun-armed ground robot. You actually saw a picture of it. It looked a little bit like a lawnmower with a .50 caliber machine gun on top of it. When they did a demonstration of it for a group of VIPs, it went, quote, squirrely. It started spinning in a circle and pointed its weapon system at the review stand of VIPs. They were very happy that there were no bullets in the machine gun at the time. Other time oops moments can be tragic. Just about 2 years ago in South Africa, an automated anti-aircraft cannon had a, quote, software glitch. We've all experienced these software glitches before. Well, in this case, the cannon, which was supposed to fire upwards into the sky during a training exercise, instead leveled, and it started firing in a circle. It killed 9 soldiers before it ran out of ammunition. It was the scene from the movie RoboCop playing out in reality. And the point is not just that this happened, but how do we respond? Imagine if you were the young investigator who was asked to resolve this issue. What system of laws would you turn to for guidance? Because what we have playing out here is 21st century technology, like a Reaper drone that can take off and land on its own, that is smart enough that if it sees footprints in a field, to backtrack those footprints. We have this 21st century technology being applied against 21st century actors in war, like an insurgent who hides out in a house surrounded by women and children, not because they're ignorant of the laws of war, but because they are deliberately violating them. So you have these two 21st century poles and the laws of war from the 20th century caught in the middle. So for example, the most important technology to come out the year that the Geneva Conventions were written was actually the 45 RPM record player. It's a lot to ask of a law that's so old to keep up with this technology. And actually, when I was at Human Rights Watch doing interviews there was a great moment for a writer where two of the leaders, I asked them, well, what system of law do we turn to if a predator drone strike goes awry? And they got in an argument in front of me rather than answering me directly. One of them was saying it's the Geneva Conventions, like we've always looked to. And the other one argued back at them, no, Geneva Conventions really don't apply in this circumstance. We should turn to the Star Trek Prime Directive for guidance. And he was serious. Now, I'm a Trekkie, I love it, but the problem is we can't actually call Captain Kirk as a real expert in a real court of law. And so, in ending, it sounds like I've been talking about the future. But notice how every single example I gave you, every single picture you saw, is not from the future. The dangerous idea is that it's actually from our present. And this sets an incredible challenge before us. Are we going to let the fact that this looks like science fiction, feels like science fiction, keep us from facing the reality of not only technology, but the reality of war today?
Well, thank you, Peter. That was just fascinating and I think quite provocative, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions. There are microphones, I think, to either side, so if you do have questions, can you please head over to the mics? And we'll take them alternately from each side as I see you. Just as we warm up there, Peter, one thought that maybe I'd really like you to weave into what you've got to say, because I think it's going to be on many of our minds. If there are all these problems and challenges for democratic countries such as Australia in coming to grips with this future, with this present, how do we balance that against the fact that no doubt there will be other societies, other forces. You mentioned terrorists, for example. I think some other cultures maybe that might be more comfortable with robotics than we are. How do we balance that with the fact that we might be playing ourselves into a disadvantage? I want you to keep that perhaps in mind as you tackle these questions here. Because
certainly, it's a great question because it's really, again, not so much about the technology, but what you're asking is really, why do we have ethics in war? Why do we have laws of war? It is a place where killing happens. You know, why would do laws even matter? And the reality is that you can argue this both from an ethical lens or from just a very pragmatic lens. And the reason is, on the ethical side, it's the existence of these laws that really does distinguish war from murder, or at least that's the way we've described it. It's the idea of professionals engaging versus just murder taking place. But there's another part of it where, if we're being very selfish, if we look throughout history, it's the nations that have followed some type of ethical code, created some kind of professional force, and applied that in war that have usually won in war. And so the answer to this is whether you want to have kind of your left-wing, granola, there's a reason for following laws from that perspective, or if you want to be, someone who says, I only care about winning and winning at all costs, history tells you following the laws is actually the way that you win. So to me, you're also asking a question that doesn't just connect to that, but also applies to another thing, which is understanding that there's different lenses through which technology is looked at. What was fascinating to me in the research was finding that the perspectives on robotics are very distinct when you go around the globe. So in Western culture, the robot has almost always been the mechanical servant that wises up and then rises up. It's everything from the very first mention of the word in the play R.U.R. back in the 1920s to the Terminator movies. But if you go to East Asia, if you go to Japan or Korea or the like, the robot is actually usually the hero in things like anime. And so what we're seeing is actually very different attitudes towards things like the arming of autonomous weapon systems. Something kind of freaky, you saw the video of the machine gun armed robot. In Korea, there's actually a TV commercial by Samsung, that makes big screen TVs, celebrating it. Isn't it awesome that we've made an autonomous machine gun robot? If you go to northern Pakistan, of course, it's a much different perspective because science fiction really hasn't penetrated there. And in the book, there's a discussion of a tribal leader who basically says, this must all be black magic, because to him, this is just the work of the devil. It's not, through a science fiction lens, it's through a different lens.
We'll take some questions, I think, from this side of the room, at the microphone there. I'll take the first question.
Thank you very much for your talk. And don't mean to be frivolous with this question. It's more the ethics of human beings. The guy who offered you who said that for $50,000 he'd shut down Manhattan, did he mean that's what it would cost, or that was the size of the bribe?
It was what it would cost. He basically went through a pretty detailed scenario. He was a scientist who builds robotics for the military, designs new ones, and he said, essentially, if you gave me $50,000, I could go off and build enough to be able to shut down Manhattan. And he actually had a pretty detailed plan of how to do it. My publisher is in New York, so they didn't want the details of that plan in the book.
We'll take a question over this side. Over this side.
Peter, today you've referenced popular culture a fair bit, and mentioned a couple of touch points between the entertainment industry and the defence industry. For example, I think we saw the US Army video game come up on screen where you're seeing them branch into the entertainment industry, and at the same time you're seeing research and development done by the entertainment industry, like Xbox controllers, actually being used in Iraq to control war robots. So my question is, what do you think of the current state of the relationship between the entertainment industry and the defence industry? Do you see a convergence, and where do you see it going in the future?
It's a great question. I actually did an article on this a few months ago called Meet the Sims and Kill Them. And what it's about is the rise or the redefinition of what's called militainment. And militainment has traditionally been about the field of entertainment celebrating war, which is nothing new. I mean, it happens today in our movies. It goes back to the Iliad. But what's different today is that the direction's moving in the other direction, where the military is using the tools of the entertainment industry to carry out its mission. And it covers the entire spectrum of military functionality. So the front end, as you mentioned, is the rise of video games like, for example, America's Army or UMA Defense, which is one that's popular in the Middle East. These are video games that are created to help recruitment. America's Army is incredibly popular, not just in America, but even in other nations. For example, 1 out of every 49 British citizens has joined America's Army, the video game version. Then there's the use of the technologies in operating systems. As you saw, the military's been using things like Xbox or PlayStation controllers to operate these systems. And the reason is they figured out, essentially, they could free ride off of the military, off of the entertainment complex, that companies like Sony and Microsoft had spent millions of dollars designing the little thing that would fit in your hand just right. So why not just copy that design? And then also, they trained a generation of 18-year-olds so that if you handed it to them, they could utilize it without thinking about it, as opposed to if you handed someone a M16 rifle and said, you know, deconstruct this, a lot of 18-year-olds wouldn't be able to do that automatically, as opposed to handing them a PlayStation controller. The final end of this is what's interesting, is it's not just within leading people to join the military or operate in the military, but even after the fact. We're seeing the use of video game platforms for treatment for things like PTSD, for post-traumatic stress disorder, where they're utilizing this as a system to help a soldier who's having these kind of stress-related aspects from experiencing a trauma in war to re-experience it in a virtual world. So it's the entire spectrum of war. It's a very interesting thing that's going on. The disturbing thing to me is not that the military's doing this, but it's more about our engagement with it. So as an illustration, that video game, America's Army, it came out on Veterans Day in America. 4.7 million people played America's Army on our Veterans Day. Comparatively, each year the U.S. Army has to convince the parents of 70,000 teenagers to join the Army. So for 4.7 million Americans on Veterans Day, their engagement with war was this video game. Most of them didn't even know they were doing so on Veterans Day, as compared to just 70,000 parents wrestling with whether their son or daughter should join the military or not. That's an interesting question for our democracies.
Thanks. We'll take another question from this side of the room at the microphone. Please, sir, go to the microphone if you want to take the question. Be happy to take your question in the queue.
Thanks. That was a fascinating talk, Peter. Thank you. My interest is in the leaching of military technology into domestic law enforcement. I know that there are some systems that have been used, especially in the United States, like the active denial system and the long-range acoustic device, and there is an increasing tendency of law enforcement agencies to rely on drones to improve their capacity for surveillance. What do you think is the future for this sort of technology in the domestic law enforcement realm?
It's a great question because it illustrates, again, how technology has these ripple effects, and one of them is that technologies that start out in the realm of war move on to civilian life and fundamentally sometimes changing civilian life. The classic example of this is the internet, which started out being developed by DARPA and then moved on to shaping and changing our world. The law enforcement side of this is very interesting. So the Predator drone. Do you think the Predator drone is a military-only technology? Well, too late. It's already being used by a number of law enforcement agencies. In the United States, for example, it's utilized for border control. What's interesting is it then is starting to ripple out. We're seeing police departments start to seek out this technology. The Miami-Dade Police Department, the LA Police Department, the Vancouver, the London ones are all exploring using unmanned aerial systems. We're even seeing these quasi-police groups that are sometimes like vigilante groups. You may have heard in the United States we have what are called the border militias. There's one of these that runs its own private border patrol along the Mexico-Arizona border. They operate 3 drones that they bought for $25,000. Now, the questions that come out of this, I remember meeting with a U.S. federal district court judge, and she said, you know, look, these for us will be constitutional level questions of issues like privacy or probable cause. Fundamental rights will have to be looked at again because of this technology. So for example, a search and seizure warrant in the United States and in most Western democracies, usually it's been that the police need to see something to be able to enter into the home. They can't look over the fence. In Northern California, in the fall, we had an interesting illustration of the changes of this. We had forest fires there, and so they asked the U.S. military to retask drones that had been used for trying to find terrorists to fly over the forest and see where the hot spots were so that firefighters could more efficiently put out the fires. Well, in the course of flying over the forest, they discovered that some people use the forest for hiking, other people use it for growing marijuana. And the military guys were left with the question. We've detected illegal activity without a warrant because we're the sort of all-seeing eye in the sky. Can we tell the local police about it? And ultimately, they were told, yes, you can tell them, but only if you go home and call them on the anonymous civilian tip line on the phone. And it's a great illustration of just how we haven't yet set up the fundamentals of the laws and how law enforcement might use it. Or another illustration is, so I'm an American, and we jealously guard our Second Amendment, our right to bear arms. Well, does that include the right to bear robotic arms? Sounds very silly, except last year in Atlanta, the owner of a pub didn't like the fact that there were homeless gathering in a parking lot nearby. He thought it was bad for his business. So he built BumBot. And BumBot was actually a robot that had these non-lethal weapon systems that you mentioned in your question. And he sent them out to chase away the homeless. Is that legal or not?